Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. After the presentation, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question, you may press star 1. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Your host for today's conference is Ms. Irene Ayer. Thank you. You may begin.
Hello, and welcome to today's FDA webinar. I am Irene Ayer of CDRH's Office of Communication and Education. On December 9, 2015, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued the final version of the guidance document, Pre-Market Notification Requirements, concerning gowns intended for use in healthcare settings. This guidance clarifies and describes the pre-market regulatory requirements for gowns regulated under 21 CFR 878.4040 and the performance testing needed to support liquid barrier claims for gowns intended for use in healthcare settings. The focus of today's webinar is to review the document and help manufacturers and other interested stakeholders understand information provided in the final guidance. Your presenters are Terrell Cunningham and Lauren Lilly, both scientific reviewers from the Office of Device Evaluation. Following the presentation, we will open the line for your questions related to topics in the guidance only. Additionally, there are other center subject matter experts available to assist with the Q&A portion of our webinar. Now, I give you Terrell.
Good afternoon. I would like to also add my thank you to all of those who have joined us for today's discussion. I am Terrell Cunningham, Team Lead for Personal Protective Equipment in the Infection Control Branch. Today we're going to discuss the recently published guidance document, Pre-Market Notification Requirements concerning gowns intended for use in healthcare and FDA's regulation of surgical gowns. Different types of gowns are used in various healthcare settings to prevent the transmission of infection and illness. This guidance clarifies the pre-market regulation requirement and the need to support liquid barrier claims for these gowns. For the purpose of today's discussion, the term surgical gown will be used to refer to the gowns that are intended for use in healthcare. Today's discussion will start with a review of the scope of the guidance document and device classification. Next, Dr. Lauren Lilly will provide an overview of FDA's pre-market review of gowns and the recommended performance testing, labeling requirements, and we will conclude with FDA's expectations of gown manufacturers. It is important to ensure healthcare workers and patients are adequately protected and informed about their protective equipment. Hopefully, this information presented today will reinforce current knowledge that you have about FDA review of surgical gowns. The scope of this document is limited to gowns making liquid barrier protection claims and intended for use in healthcare settings. For the purpose of this guidance, the terms minimal or low barrier protection refers to ANSI AAMI PB70 Level 1 and Level 2 protection or equivalent levels of protection. The terms moderate or high barrier protection refers to PB70 Level 3 and Level 4 protection. Please note that this guidance does not address the data needed to support gowns making claims of providing protection against specific organisms, chemical agents, chemotherapy drugs, or those gowns that are labeled to provide specific disease prevention claims, such as Ebola. Manufacturers desiring to market their gowns with these types of claims or design features are encouraged to utilize the pre-market submission process to obtain guidance from the agency prior to submission of a 510K. Surgical gowns are classified under the surgical apparel regulation. Surgical apparel, by definition, are intended to be worn to protect both the patient and the healthcare worker from transfer of microorganisms, body fluids and particulate matter. Surgical apparel includes surgical caps, hoods, masks, gowns, operating room shoes and shoe covers, isolation masks, and isolation gowns. The primary function of a surgical gown is to act as a barrier. All surgical gowns are Class II devices subject to special controls and require 510K clearance by FDA. Surgical apparel other than surgical gowns and surgical masks are Class I. Class I devices are subject to general controls and are exempt from pre-market notification procedures. In determining whether a gown is intended for use as a surgical gown under the surgical apparel regulation, FDA considers the terminology used, the level of barrier protection claimed, and the device's technological characteristics. A gown is a Class I exempt and not a surgical gown if all of the following factors apply. It is labeled as a gown other than a surgical gown, for example, an isolation gown. It is not described in its labeling as a surgical gown, and it has a statement relating to barrier protection, such as claims of minimum, low, or no barrier protection. If all of the above factors apply, the gown is considered Class I exempt from pre-market notification, or simply put, no 510K is required. The device is a Class I exempt because general controls are sufficient to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of the device. For purposes of determining classification of a gown under the surgical apparel regulation, a gown falling within this regulation is a surgical gown if any of the following apply. It is labeled as such using terminology such as surgical gown or surgical isolation gown. It is described as such in its labeling. This gown is suitable as a surgical gown. It has a statement relating to moderate or high-level barrier protection, PB70 level 3 or 4 barrier claims, or claims of impervious, prevents strike-through, fluid-proof, or impermeable. It has statements that it is intended for use during sterile procedures, that it also includes sterile isolation gowns or gowns distributed in sterile packages. FDA considers gowns that claim moderate to high-level barrier protection to be a higher risk than those that claim minimum or low levels of barrier protection. All gowns with level 3 and level 4 barrier claims are considered Class II devices under the surgical apparel regulation and are subject to pre-market review. All Class II gowns are subject to pre-market review. This includes surgical gowns and surgical isolation gowns. Isolation gowns are Class I. However, they become Class II if additional claims are made, such as moderate or high barrier function, or claims associated with a PB70 level 3 or level 4. These gowns are defined as surgical isolation gowns and should be reviewed by FDA. Isolation gowns with barrier function claims are defined again as surgical isolation gowns.
Hello, my name is Lauren Lilly, and I'd like to give an overview of what information FDA expects or recommends be provided when submitting a 510K for a surgical gown. Most of the information I will mention today can be found in our two guidance documents relating to gowns, the 1993 guidance document for pre-market notification submissions for surgical gowns and drapes, as well as the guidance document published most recently, which is a supplement to the 1993 guidance. We also recommend that sponsors look at guidance documents relating to the 510K process and what general information is recommended when submitting a 510K. Links to guidance documents referenced in this talk will be included at the end of this presentation. When it comes to review of gowns with moderate or high barrier claims, information regarding performance and safety testing conducted should be submitted. For liquid barrier testing, FDA recommends the use of FDA-recognized standard ANSI/AMI PB70. Depending on the level of barrier protection claim, water impact penetration, hydrostatic pressure resistance, and resistance to viral penetration are testing methods recommended by the standard. In addition to barrier integrity testing, safety is also an important aspect, and sponsors are expected to provide data demonstrating that the device is safe for use. We will look more closely at FDA expectations and recommendations regarding pre-market notifications in the upcoming slides. Representative engineer drawings should be included with your submission, and the critical, non-critical zones as well as the same should be identified. Any special features should also be depicted. Sample labeling should also be submitted. The provided labeling should clearly identify the level of liquid barrier protection claimed prior to the existence of ANSI/AMI PB70. Moderate or high barrier protection claims included, but were not limited to wording such as prevents strike-through, highest fluid protection, impervious, fluid-proof, fluid-resistant, highest level of protection, and impermeable. Because of the lack of specificity with respect to performance characteristics and test methods, FDA now discourages the use of such language and no longer clears products with such labeling claims. Instead, manufacturers are encouraged to specify the level of liquid barrier protection as per ANSI/AMI PB70 on all labeling. Labeling should also include the directions for use, the indications for use, and if applicable, validate reprocessing instructions. For gowns making moderate to high barrier claims, sponsors are expected to provide data to support claims when submitting a pre-market notification. Therefore, sponsors should provide evidence that the gown complies with the complied level of liquid barrier protection according to ANSI/AMI PB70 or an equivalent test method. Copies of performance test data should be provided for FDA review. This information is necessary to support barrier performance claims. FDA recommends that an adequate, statistically significant sample size is used. Generally, we recommend a sample size of approximately 32 gowns. Liquid barrier testing should be done in all critical zones and non-critical zones, including the back of the gown. FDA also recommends that performance at the seams of the gown should also be tested. Please note that for surgical isolation gowns, that is, isolation gowns with moderate to high liquid barrier level claims, the critical zone encompasses the entire gown. For surgical gowns intended for use in the operating room, the critical zone is defined as the front mid-chest area to about the knees, as well as the lower arms. The non-critical zones of surgical gowns can have any protection level from 1 to 4. Additionally, the back of the surgical gown may be non-protective according to PB70, but must be specifically labeled as such. In addition to providing performance data, a clear description of the device design, including all models, dimensions, and manufacturing specifications and tolerances, should be stated for each device design. Additionally, all materials, including adhesives, and dyes, should be specified. Representative engineer drawings should be included with your submission, and the critical, non-critical zones as well as the seams should be identified. Additionally, sample labeling should clearly identify the level of the liquid barrier protection as per ANSI/AMI PB70. As mentioned previously, claims such as prevents strike-through, highest fluid protection, impervious, fluid-proof, fluid-resistant, highest level of protection, and impermeable are no longer cleared by FDA. Please be sure to include sample labeling that also includes the directions for use and indications for use. When submitting a 510K, all components of the device should be listed and the use life of each component of the device should be identified. Therefore, manufacturers are expected to state if the gown or any part of the gown is intended for single use, single patient use, or multiple patient use. Under the 510K program, substantial equivalence is evaluated. Therefore, a comparison table between the subject and predicate device is expected. The comparison table should include a comparison of the indications for use, the materials used in constructing the devices, sterilization methods, and importantly, the PB70 level of the subject and predicate device. Additionally, sterilization according to the K90 guidance document issued by FDA should also be included, particularly the sterilization method, validation method, and packaging information should be included. If the device is also intended to be sterilized by repackagers, sterilization instructions according to the reference sterilization method should be included. While a shelf life claim is not required at this time for gowns, single-use and reusable gowns with shelf life claims should be supported by testing performed at the end of shelf life. To support a shelf life claim, it is FDA's expectation that performance testing at the end of shelf life demonstrates that aging does not adversely affect the performance of the gown. FDA recommends that at minimum, sponsors should assess the liquid barrier performance of the device at the end of the claimed shelf life. If the device or gown is intended to be reusable, in addition to demonstrating the barrier performance at the end of shelf life, the performance of the gown at the end of the maximum reprocessing cycles should also be demonstrated. The reprocessing protocol used to assess the liquid barrier performance at the end of the labeled use life should be similar to the reprocessing instructions included in the labeling. The maximum number of reprocessing cycles should also be stated on the labeling. Presented on this slide are the 4 performance levels according to ANSI/AMY PB70. The level a gown obtains is determined by its ability to resist fluid penetration under the conditions described in the table presented on this page. Level 1 and Level 2 liquid barrier performance claims are considered minimal or low levels of performance. Conversely, Level 3 and Level 4 are considered to provide moderate or high levels of protection. To reiterate, isolation gowns making moderate or high level liquid barrier claims are defined as surgical isolation gowns and should be reviewed by FDA. For Level 3 gowns, please note that according to PB70, both AATCC 42 impact penetration testing and AATCC 127 hydrostatic water pressure testing should be performed. We also advise that the sampling plan recommended by ANSI/AMY PB70, that is an AQL of 4% with an alpha of 0.05 and an RQL of 20% with a beta of 0.1 is followed. In addition to barrier performance testing, it is recommended that sponsors also assess the physical and mechanical properties of gowns. It is FDA's expectation that gowns should have the physical strength to resist tears and punctures. Secondly, the gown should be comfortable to wear. As such, we recommend that non-barrier property testing, such as grab tensile strength, snag resistance, linting, heat loss, and water vapor transmission be performed. Data from flammability testing according to 16 CFR Part 1610 should also be documented within the submission. If the device is a surgical gown and therefore requires to be sterile, the sterilization method and validation should be stated. Again, if the device is labeled reusable, either as a single patient reusable or multiple patient reusable, laundering instructions should be described. The maximum number of uses, as well as the method used in order to track the number of uses, should be stated and presented in the labeling. Lastly, in addition to physical and mechanical related testing, the device should be demonstrated to be safe for use. Biocompatibility is an important safety aspect for gowns and therefore needs to be assessed. FDA recommends the use of ISO 10993 Part 10 for skin contacting devices, and that skin irritation and sensitization should be assessed.
Hello, I'm Terrell Cunningham again, and I will conclude today's discussion with FDA expectations on what we expect from manufacturers. Manufacturers posing to market the current gowns that have Class 2 or as described in this guidance should accomplish the following. 1, submit a 510K for the gown to the agency within 60 days of the publication of the final guidance. The due date for this will be February the 7th, 2016. Number 2, have a 510K submission for the gown accepted by the agency for review within 75 days of the publication of the final guidance. The due date for the 75-day publication from publication is February 22nd, 2016. Thirdly, obtain a 510K clearance for the gown within 180 days from the publication of the final guidance. This will be due June 6, 2016. FDA intends to work interactively with manufacturers as appropriate during the review process. If a manufacturer has completed steps 1 and 2 above but has not received clearance of its device within the 180 days because of the submission remains under active review, the manufacturer should contact FDA to discuss whether the agency intends to continue to defer enforcement under these circumstances. FDA recommends that surgical gowns cleared for marketing meet the minimal performance specifications provided in the guidances that are listed on the slide above. These documents may be found at the websites that are listed. Other relevant FDA guidances are listed on the next 2 slides. FDA recognized consensus standards facilitate the pre-market review process. FDA recognized standards for surgical gowns are listed on the next 2 slides. The use of these standards produce voluntary consensus among industry, healthcare device users, and FDA. The standards provide a defined qualification criteria for the device quality assurance. Consensus standards are updated as technology and experiences advance. This concludes our portion of the presentation, and we're now ready to accept questions.
Thank you. At this time, we will now begin the question and answer session. To ask a question, please press star 1. You will be prompted to record your first and last name. To withdraw your request, press star 2. Once again, press star 1 to ask a question. Please stand by for our first question. Our first question comes from Mark Premarket. Your line is now open.
Thank you, and we appreciate the opportunity to get some clarification. I just wanted to find out if I label my gown for sterile use in compounding pharmacies, does the surgical guidance apply to this?
Mark, this is Terrell Cunningham. If I understand your question correct, would there be any patient contact? What is the intended use of that function?
No patient contact whatsoever. It's for mixing solutions in a compounding pharmacy.
My initial response is that may fall more of an occupational use and not necessarily a healthcare function, which was the intent of our guidance document. But to just be on the safe side, I would recommend that you would email that question, afford us an opportunity to research it, and we will give you formal feedback via email. And thank you for the question.
Can I get that email address, or is that just FDA.gov?
It will be the email address that's posted on the slide.
Excellent. Okay, I appreciate the initial reply, and we'll put it in writing for further guidance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Daniel Gluckson. You may ask your question.
Hi, and thank you for taking the question. You mentioned, Mr. Cunningham, you mentioned some dates like February 7th. Is that the expected date of the publication of the final guidance?
The actual guidance document that we are discussing today was published on December the 9th, 2015.
Okay.
Based on that guidance document, there were several dates that were crucial. There was a 60 date, 75, and 180. And if you look at that slide, it will actually clarify on which date what was expected.
All right, thanks.
Our next question comes from Mike Ashola. You may ask your question.
Hello, Terrell. It's Mike. How are you?
Doing well, Mike. How are you?
Good. I have a question for you. So the guidance document says or equivalent to AMI PV70. But AMI PV70 also not only describes barrier performance, it also describes an AQL level. So I want to make sure that I understand that. If you make a claim to barrier resistance without an AQL level, it's not equivalent, right?
Restate your question again, please.
So AMI PV70 describes 4 levels of protection. It also describes an AQL level. If you make claims in your in the guidance document, the document was published in December, it says or equivalent. So I'm asking the question, if you make the claims of meeting ASTM 1671, but no claims around an AQL, is that equivalent?
I would not interpret that as being equivalent because you have failed to provide evidence that your product meets the pass-fail criteria as stated within the standard. When we use the term...
I want to make sure this is a very pertinent point, in that AMI PV70 describes a quality level, and people describe compliance with standards without AQL. And I want to make sure that I understand the fact that if you don't describe an AQL, it's not equivalent. Because your guidance document says all over the place equivalent.
Hi, my name is Erin Keith. I'm the division director that houses for the division that houses INCB. What I wanted to make clear to you is about in the language that you're talking about is the ASTM standard is a voluntary standard, and we do not require voluntary standards as law, but what we say is that you can provide alternative testing at times in general circumstances, and the guidance is trying to leave open the window for circumstances where someone would provide equivalent methodology to that standard but not yet meet that specific standard. So as Carol was saying, we would, because the standard itself addresses the AQL level, we would expect the equivalent alternative testing that was submitted or suggested is equivalent to address those issues and explain why they are equivalent.
Okay, so I have one more question. What differentiates a gown from a coverall?
This is Terrell. I will attempt to provide a response. When you look at the actual title of our guidance document, it's focused on gowns intended for use in healthcare settings. While we definitely use the term gown, the actual publication is concerned that there are other products, and we've talked about the terminologies that have been used in describing some of the other products as being cover gowns, procedure gowns, and whereas the actual name that you call that product is not as important as what is the intended use of the product. What is the function? What are the claims? So when we look at our guidance document, I think we have to really read the guidance document and seek to understand what the agency's concerns are. The concerns are that you have a product that's being promoted for use in the healthcare setting that hasn't been proven or cleared by the agency, and we're concerned with the uses and the functions of that product. So that's a question I think that we could entertain offline. It's a very direct question, and it's an important question. But I believe we've stated, and I don't know if you recall in some of the CB70 meetings that we've entertained that discussion, that when you have an overall and you're actually making disease prevention claims, you have tripped the exemption of that device, and you brought it into medical device land.
All right, thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Hannah Shulham. Your line is now open.
Hello, this is Wing Ying from Medtronic. Thank you so much for the overview and the guidance document. So my question is in regards to page 8 of the guidance for what is in scope of a Class 2 surgical gown. So there are 4 bullet points that are listed, and my interpretation of that, and I want confirmation, is that it's if any one of those applies, not all 4. Is that correct?
It would just so happen I don't have page 8, but I do recall our discussion, and for the purpose of determining classification, if all of those apply.
Okay. And I think this goes to the previous couple of questions that were asked.
No,
one of them was regarding...
Let me just clarify that. It's not all. It's any of those 4. Lauren, you're going to speak to it? There's an or. If it's labeled as such, if it's described in its labeling as such, if it has a statement relating to moderate or high level barrier protection, or if there's a statement that is intended for use during sterile procedure. So if any of those apply, it would be considered a Class 2 gown.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I have a follow-up question to that. So the 3rd bullet says if it has a statement relating to moderate or high-level barrier protection. And in the last question that you answered, you talked about this guidance document being applicable to the healthcare setting. So if there were kind of a non-surgical application for a specific gown that was used in the healthcare setting for, let's say, mixing personal protective equipment for mixing caustic drugs or other types of chemicals, but it was still in the healthcare setting, would that put those products within the scope of Class 2 surgical gowns if it had the statement of moderate to high-level barrier protection?
Yes, it would. And if you recall, there was one of the slides, I don't have the number, that actually addressed some of the intended uses that went beyond the scope that we recommend that you use the pre-submission process to obtain greater or more information. We are concerned with gowns that are labeled to provide protection against chemical agents or chemotherapy agents. There is an expectation that you have actual performance test data that demonstrates that performance and that that product be labeled accordingly. So I would encourage you to use the avenue for follow-up discussion as it relates to that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Erla Clark. Your line is now open.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation today. My question has to do with understanding whether you have guidance available for hospital equipment vendors on the correct gowns or coveralls for engineers to wear when servicing equipment in the hospital oncology compounding area. I've read a number of comments that the most effective and protective gowns are the ones that are the hottest. They don't dissipate heat, moisture. So it sounds as though that's not what's covered here today, but I'm wondering if you have alternate guidance available somewhere.
Well, I thank you for the question, but at the point, I am not knowledgeable of any such guidance as it relates to that product, but we would encourage you to forward your question to our the address on the slide, and we will give you a follow-up response to that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Caroline Natelli. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Caroline Natelli from Cardinal Health. We have a couple questions for you, and we appreciate this presentation today. It's been very helpful. The first question that we have is, will FDA accept submissions for surgical isolation gowns that do not include an AAMI rating assignment to the gowns?
Repeat that question, please. Just for clarity, let me just repeat it to you, and you tell me if I've understood it correctly.
Okay.
Am I understanding you correct in your intent is to submit a 510K for a gown that would be under the classification of a surgical isolation gown. However, there would be no reference to PB70 classification, meaning there would be an expectation of a level 3 or a level 4. And you're questioning whether or not we would review that.
Yes.
Now, I will simply make this as an initial response. While it's a voluntary standard, you don't have to comply. However, given the fact that it is a medical device, the agency expects you to have evidence that that product will perform as expected. Whether or not you make a choice to put it in your labeling that it's a level 3 or a level 4, I believe that could actually be at the discretion of management, your product line manager. However, I'll question whether or not that product would be as competitive on the market as those other products that would be clearly labeled with that level of effectiveness. But however, to answer your question, there is no requirement that it be labeled as such. However, you would have to have testing data to support that function and that claim. I wouldn't say claim, but that it performs at that level.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is, the AAMI standard PB70 describes only isolation gowns with backs, but there are many products on the market marketed as isolation gowns that don't have backs. So would FDA consider a garment used for like high fluid protection in medical settings without a back to be considered an isolation gown?
I have my thoughts, but rather than I tell you what I think it would be best that we actually discuss that question within the agency and give you a firm response. So again, if you would utilize our question to email that to us, and we will get back with you. Because when you look at our understanding of a isolation gown, that gown should provide you full coverage front and back. That would be FDA's expectation of such a product. That is how surgical gowns and isolation gowns differ in terms of full coverage as well as the level of barrier protection.
Okay. The reason that we ask this question, this kind of goes back to the first question about including the AAMI rating with the gown.
And I can understand
we'll submit it to you in writing.
Yes, thank you very much.
The next question is from Mr. Sewell. You may ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. Related to the isolation gowns that would be considered now a Class 2 medical device, if you had an existing product which you were calling a fluid-resistant gown, which would be under the original classification, does that now fall under the Class 2 classification and require a 510K?
It is my understanding that it would. It would be the term you've referenced would be equivalent to a level 3 classification, if I'm understanding your terminology correct.
So it would be fluid resistant would be considered moderate to high and require the 510K.
And it should. That is what we would expect, that it would be a level 3, and any moderate or level 3 or higher would be subject to 510K review.
Okay. If you had products that you had in inventory, is there a period of time given to sort of flush those out before the 510K comes in, product with 510K, which would be classified with the Class 2?
We do have the Office of Compliance in the room. If you would be so kind as to repeat the question, please.
Okay. If you have products which have the fluid-resistant claim, which are isolation gowns, which would have been previously considered Class 1 and now considered Class 2, is there a period of time to flush those out of inventory before the gowns with the 510K as Class 2 come in?
Yes, this would be a good conversation actually to have more offline, since we would have to really get into some discussions in terms of timing to rework your product and having an understanding that you have in fact submitted a 510K and have a clear understanding of where things are with the application to market. But yes, we would be happy to actually work with you on the phase out, if you would, or how to relabel or reconfigure your product so that you wouldn't necessarily lose inventory.
Okay, and there's no sort of sunrise date where those have to be completely out of the system.
Well, I refer you to page 9 of the guidance document, and that is where we clearly communicate what our expectations are.
Right.
Right, that would be the June, having to have everything in place by June the 6th.
That's about right, yes.
Yes. Okay, and these particular products, would be tested in manufacture. We would have to, if asked, provide evidence that we're doing, 32 tests, to the PPB 70 with an AQL of 4.
Well, you appear to have gone into great detail. So if you have a follow-up question that you would want a response, I would exercise the option of emailing the question, and we will get back to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, and that's to dice@fda.hhs.gov.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Our next question comes from Josh Uller. You may ask your question.
Hi, thank you for the session today. We have a couple of questions to clarify, just because it seemed a little ambiguous to us. So for a single-use product, there is no shelf life claim required. I just want to confirm that that's the case.
That is true.
Okay. With that in mind, for the 510K submission, are you expecting us to submit aging data as well?
When you look at what are you referencing? A sterile, non-sterile?
Non-sterile.
What are your claims? If in fact you're looking at a non-sterile surgical isolation gown, and that's your question, there is no requirement for sterility, nor is there an aging requirement, because the concerns about aging was related to products that would be sterile or products that would have other types of claims, products that would be reprocessed. That's when we start looking at our concerns of aging.
No, appreciate it. My next question is, can you recommend a predicate device to look at? We're looking specifically at a non-sterile AMI-3 gown, isolation gown. And because these haven't been approved in the past, we've been having some difficulty finding predicates.
That is totally beyond the scope of today's presentation. What I would recommend you is look at the 510K summaries that are readily on the web for some similar type of product.
Okay. So you've clarified too that isolation. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry. This is Erin Keith again. I wanted to say that you could also, for some of these more product-specific questions, there's also a pre-submission process that has its own guidance document on the FDA website that describes the process where you can ask us more directed and specific questions about your product and what sort of testing requirements would be necessary for the design features and the claims you want to make.
Okay. Just have one last question that you may defer to that as well, but I should probably ask while I'm here. For a gown made with material that meets AMI-3 requirements but does not meet the seam requirements and no AMI-3 claim is made, is that considered a Class 2 device? So it's made
what you're asking now is a very product. This is Terrell again. What you're posing is a very product-specific type of question. I think that would be best handled via our pre-submission process as a worst-case scenario, or by direct contact with me in the office, and we can actually look at your question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think there's one other person here in my meeting. Oh no, never mind. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Our next question comes from John Assault. You may ask your question.
Good afternoon. It's John Sopchak at Precept, and my question is similar to Cardinal's question. And right now, roughly based on market data for non-surgical gowns used, whatever they're called in a hospital, let's say approximately 40% of those gowns used, nearly half, are where nurses are using a isolation gown. I'll call it something other than a surgical gown. They're using an isolation gown, and for comfort, they have an open back. For protection, it varies. According to your guidance, if somebody seeks moderate or higher protection, they can't have a product. Are you proposing to eliminate that 40% of the market and have it change, or is this some confusion factor given it's public knowledge that right now the F23 AFTM committee is now trying to figure out a new isolation gown standard. So in that sense, I'm saying the 510K is being issued at the same time that the F23 committee is trying to grapple with, issues. And maybe this relates to, on your 510K guidance, on page 9, under point 3, It says representative drawings, et cetera, and include dimensions and location of the critical and non-critical zones. So for an isolation gown, the way the standard was developed, 12 or 14 years ago, the whole gown is considered to be critical zone, but as anybody would know, looking at the back of the gown, all of those gowns will fail the PB70 test because it's open in the back no matter how you cut it.
Well, again, this is a question that goes beyond the scope or the expectation of today's presentation, because what we are actually discussing is a product that has newly evolved.
This product's been around forever. This product's been around for 20 years. These types of products, open back, over-the-head gowns, have been around for a long time.
Well, just to my knowledge, having been here at FDA for 20 years, I'm totally unaccustomed to having reviewed, and we're talking about 20 years of review. I'm not accustomed to having reviewed a isolation gown with an open back, because that would have been concerned.
And I think that's because until this guidance came out, they were not subject to review. I think that's what the point is. In that sense, whether I'm right or wrong, I feel like my question kind of fits with Cardinal's question.
Well,
so
I
maybe
think your question,
if I could be, precept could be included, that may help us. We're just trying to understand what the agency's intent here is with, based on GHX kind of information. I may be off. It could be just 30% or 1/3. There's a huge amount of gowns being used with an open back, called isolation gowns, and the clinical workers do care about the protection level as well.
Well, again, I recommend that you forward that question to DICE using the slide that's posted, and also that we can openly address this question at F23.
Okay, and our representative Shane will be there to talk with you, Terrell. Thank you.
Because I think that would, and it's not so much talk with me, it's something that we need to speak to as a committee. Because
okay. Oh no, I do believe that this is something that the committee should be able to clarify. That if they have a role to play, they should have already clarified this by now. Actually, I would think.
Yeah,
but it hasn't. It's been out many years, that committee. So, and the name of the lady is to speak to. I guess Shane will speak to you, Terrell, or whoever else he needs to. We cannot see our slides today, so that's why I'm not sure how to spell the name AIM. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Our next question comes from Donna Swenson. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Donna Swenson. I'm the co-chair of PB70. And I have a question on where do the decontamination gowns that are used in sterile processing departments fall in this new guidance? They're definitely protective attire, and my personal opinion is they should be level 3 or level 4 protective attire. So, but they typically are not isolation gowns in that they're not total protection back and front. So are these considered isolation gowns? Are they considered surgical gowns where you have critical zones? I'm not clear where these really fall then.
Donna, you pose a very good question, and neither am I at this time, because in the absence of a clear indication for use, in the absence of product labeling, those are all issues that we'd have to look at to make a determination. So for formal review and to address it again, would you forward that question and concern to DICE at FDA.hhs.gov, and we will get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question comes from Josh Uller. You may ask your question.
One of my coworkers just had a quick question to get some clarification.
Hello. My question falls very in line with Precepts and Cardinals around our group trying to understand the applicability of gowns sold into the market. So based on our knowledge, about 48% of what we would call gowns used in healthcare setting are marketed either as fluid resistant, impervious, impermeable, any of those descriptors that you used before. Out of those 48%, less than 2% are AAMI compliant. So you would only have 2% of the gowns that would actually meet AAMI 3 or AAMI 4 based on the standards due to either the product not passing into seams, due to the fact that a lot of fluid-resistant gowns have sewn seams, or due to the fact that the largest gown style in the market has an open back. So we're really grappling with half of the gowns that are currently sold into healthcare, how we would fit those into your guidance. So that's the first question. The second one would be all of these questions, we're just hoping we can also get the feedback if Cardinal and Precept or anyone has asked that questions applicable to get the industry knowledge to understand that feedback, because we are struggling with how to classify these gowns.
Well, from a regulatory perspective, if I'm hearing you correct, you'll have gowns that are labeled as fluid-proof, fluid-resistant. However, you question whether or not they would pass PB70. And if, in fact, that is the clarity, that is the question, then I have a concern about accuracy of promotional product in the market.
I think that the concern would be that the material used would be referred to as a test. So that fluid resistant would be a term that's used for a product that, say it's a film, but either it has an open back or the technology to close the seams is a sewn technology. So I would agree that AAMI's looking at adjusting their standards to more reflect what's happening in the market. But it is a challenge for us when the gown coming into the market is marketed as fluid-proof, and half of the gowns in use today are. But that doesn't necessarily correlate to the AAMI standard. It might correlate to a test within the standard for the material. But the gown itself, the whole gown, the whole critical zones doesn't meet it. So we're trying to understand if we have to take fluid-resistant off our labeling. It's a challenge for us to really understand how to react, and specifically on a very tight timeline.
Hi, this is Erin Keith. So I would say at a high level in answering your question, this is the sort of situation where the part of the guidance document talks about or equivalent tests to the PB70 test. That the standard has its scope and it deals with what it defines. And when you have a product that falls within the scope of that, then it's easy to meet the requirements, the test requirements of the standard, to be able to have it match up with your claims and sort of develop the data that you need to support your marketing application. It's harder when you have a design variation from what the standard is covering, and this is where talking with INCB during the pre-submission process about the types of information to submit in order to substantiate the claims you want to make for your specific device would be the best place to have this conversation, because it would require the technical people in the branch to have a little bit better understanding about the device, and that's going to involve some trade secret confidential information. I'm quite certain you don't necessarily want to discuss this webinar. So I think that the pre-submission process or an offline phone call with the infection control devices branch would be the best way to get some of that information to you.
Okay, perfect. I think just our main concern is at a macro level, half the gowns going into the market have a fluid claim, and we just don't understand. This is not specifically just for our company, or it's consistent across the entire market. So our concern is with the timelines. If is a gown that comes into the market on June the 6th or even exists in the market no longer allowed to be sold, there could be a big disruption to what's going on right now in the healthcare market in the United States.
That's a fair point. And so what I would suggest that you then do is that you have a conversation also with the Office of Compliance about the logistics and the implications of meeting the currently established grace periods that are in the guidance document, to see how the office feels about an extension of those.
Okay, well, we appreciate your time, and hopefully through the direct emails we can get more clarity on how to proceed.
Our next question comes from Mike Shola. You may ask your question.
Hello. I'm sorry to interrupt again. Protective apparel to protect against biological agents is used outside of healthcare, and as such, it migrates into healthcare. For instance, in a crime scene or accident situation where somebody's got to pull dead bodies out of a car, people wear protective apparel, and it needs to be impervious or any level 3 or 4. And I just want to make sure that I understand that the agency is not trying to regulate those garments that are used outside of healthcare. Because, if you were a sewage worker in Philadelphia and a sewage line broke, you would probably want the same protection that a healthcare worker would. Go down in that sewage line and repair it.
This is Erin Keith. The guidance document only applies to things that are medical devices, and in this that meet the specific scope of what the guidance document is dealing with. If you have questions about other applications or other products, there are different mechanisms in which to receive feedback on that. One of them would be the 513G process, where you could submit for clarity on the standing of other products.
I'm sorry, what was that process again?
It's referred to as the 513G submission process. And you can send a question related to that to the DICE email address, and we can get you linkages to information about how to go about doing that.
Okay, thank you.
I believe that was our last question. Thank you. This is Irene Ahir. We appreciate your participation and thoughtful questions. Today's presentation and transcript will be made available on the CDRH Learn webpage at www.fda.gov/training/CDRH Learn by Thursday, January 28th. If you have additional questions about the final guidance document, please use the contact information provided at the end of this slide presentation. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Again, thank you for participating. This concludes today's webinar.
Thank you. This concludes today's conference. Participants, you may disconnect at this time.